Hello, Elliott. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. So I'm resuming my so-called conversations with friends, kind of informal interviews after a break of a few months. And I'm very happy that today I'm with Elliott Abrams, one of the most distinguished people in foreign policy that I know anyway, and in general. Elliott served under three different American administrations, Reagan, the second Bush, and more briefly under Trump. And he's, of course, been involved in foreign policy issues for decades now, to do with Latin America, but in particularly to do with the Middle East, Iran, the Arab world, North Africa, and Israel. So, Elliott, if you don't mind, I'm just going to start off with something a little bit to the point. You're one of the few people that I know of anyway that served and knew personally three different presidents. That's Reagan, the younger Bush, and Trump. Would you like to share any recollections of dealings with them or your opinions of them?
Well, I knew George W. Bush much better because I worked in the White House and saw him all the time. I would say one thing about George W. Bush. I think he is greatly underappreciated. One has to remember where we were after 9/11. The world had changed. The country had changed. There was a possibility of real anti-Muslim bias and actions. The whole world looked to the United States, Europe, the Middle East. What was going to happen? And all of this landed on his shoulders. And I saw it, from close up. Had he failed in the sense of being unprepared morally, had he seemed to be uncertain, tired, unwilling, it would have been obvious first to those of us on the staff, but then I think to the country and to the world. And he did not fail in those days and weeks. And one remembers his speech in the National Cathedral just days later, his appearance down in lower Manhattan at the site of the World Trade Center. I think it was partly, it was character. It was religious faith. I think the thing that I remember most about Reagan was the unfailing good humor. He was just a delight to deal with at all times and had an unending supply of stories from his Hollywood days, some of them quite off color. But he was, the way you can define a bad boss is that when someone needs to say something to the boss or to see the boss, whether it's on Wall Street or in a company or in a government, it's always, you do it. Why don't you go in and see him? With Reagan, of course, it was always the opposite. It was a delight to be with him. I spent less time with Trump, much less time. But I found that much more than Reagan or Bush, when you were with him, it was always about Trump. That is, it wasn't about Iran or the Middle East or Europe or Ukraine. It was always, me. It was always, what does it mean to me? And I would say one other thing about it, which was equally bad, which was that he didn't know much about these situations. If we're thinking about, say, European history in the 20th century, which you need to have some sense of to understand Ukraine today, he was, in that sense, the least prepared.
Let me just go back over those. It just happens to be that we're doing this on September 11th. It's the 22nd anniversary today. Let me just pair for a second Reagan and Bush. at the time that Reagan was the president, and I was my last days of high school and then at university, he was very hated. This is in London, but globally among the liberal elites, he was a warmonger, evil empire, all that kind of stuff. Some people disliked him more than they disliked the Soviet leaders then. Over time, people I know who severely dislike Reagan have softened on him, and they now speak about him in rather benign, nice ways, and you know, they've softened their approach. Even some of them even admire him. Do you think with Bush, again, at the time, those people who opposed the war in Iraq were rather ferocious, to put it mildly, with their you know, their language about George W. Bush? Do you think we're now also entering a period where in future people will look, you know, rather more kindly over Bush? As you said, they'll look historically that it was extraordinarily difficult to deal with 9/11 for any president, especially one who wasn't really planning to be particularly a foreign policy president. So do you think we're in that period where people will look upon Bush more favorably?
I do. Maybe this will even happen to Tony Blair someday. But
maybe.
I don't.
Yeah.
I'm a great admirer of Blair's, but I must say I think you're right, Tom. But I would not like to cut much slack to those people. That is, I think it's fine. I think it's good that they're coming around to see what they did wrong 20 years ago, but they ought to admit it. That is, I now hear friends who are Democrats and public figures who are Democrats saying, oh, I wish for the old days when, you know, American politics was so much more friendly. Well, it wasn't very friendly, as I recall it in those days. We used to have the expression Bush derangement syndrome.
Right.
And I wish those people would publicly say, I regret some of the words I used and the positions I took and the ways I described Reagan or George W. Bush. And I don't, you know, I do see people taking a more sensible position, but I don't see them acknowledging what they did 20 or 40 years ago.
If I might add to that, I think there's a certain level of denial. One of the other interviews I've done in this series is one of Britain's most admired pundits from The Guardian. He's one of their lead opinion writers. And it was during Trump was still at the end of his presidency. And I was saying, I think it's unhelpful to use terms like fascist. One can criticize Trump without using language like this, which is not accurate or appropriate. And they said, and I said, by the way, you've done this before, The Guardian, when Bush was there. And he denied it. He said, no, we never used the word fascist when Bush was presidency. But I looked it up afterwards, not him personally, but The Guardian absolutely used the word fascist and similar terminology. And my position being that it's unhelpful, in fact, shoots yourself in the foot. Even with Trump, Trump has enough negatives about him that one doesn't have to exaggerate. Let it speak for themselves, and people can make their own judgment on Trump one way or the other. That's my view, and you're right. Not just, might add, on Reagan, but also on the Soviets. You know, I was taught by, some of my contemporaries at Oxford used to say things like, well, Thatcher's so awful, at least the health system in Ceausescu's Romania works. And I'm like, people were literally starving to death or got AIDS children or whatever in Romania. So there's been very little acknowledgement, not just of what they said about Bush and Reagan, and might even add Mitt Romney, the candidate. You know, if all Republicans are bad, then you end up with Trump in a way.
Yeah.
If they're all equally bad, if the New York Times thinks all Republicans are bad, well, Republicans say we might as well vote Trump then, you know.
I think you're getting a very good example of this in Israel today,
right?
Where I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, look, I oppose these judicial reform proposals. I think they're very bad. That's a far cry from saying, this is a coup. This is fascism. This is the end of democracy. One of the people who's kept a level head is Natan Sharansky, whom I saw recently during a visit to Israel. And while I was talking with him, someone came over and said, will you be at the demonstration? This is the anti-reform demonstration. And he said no. And the young man said, why not? And he said, basically, it's the term dictatorship. Sharansky lived in the Soviet dictatorship, and he doesn't want to participate in demonstrations that are calling Israel a dictatorship or potential dictatorship. And it's that kind of level-headedness that we are both calling for.
Yeah, in fact, with Sharansky, he didn't just live in the Soviet Union for speaking his mind, for asking the Soviet Union to honor its own constitution. He was imprisoned for many years in solitary confinement for part of that. So, you know, anyone, and even myself or yourself, who've dealt with real dictatorships, and when I obviously haven't dealt with them like you, but I, as a young teenager, 13 years old, went to communist Czechoslovakia with my grandmother, went to East Berlin with the same grandmother, went on a school trip to the Soviet Union. Even I, as a youngster, know what actual dictatorship is, what actual fascism is. I think anyone who's had relatives in the Holocaust knows what, you know, so it's preposterous to call any member of the Israeli government, even the extremists among them, dictators or fascists, whatever. They are misusing and watering down and trivializing the term. And there's been too much of that in Israel. I also think that it's sort of self-destructive because they lose the argument that they're making against the judicial reform proposals of the government. You lose it in this hateful and partisan language where someone like me just like zooms out. I mean, I've done a couple of written on the judicial reform, and I got literal hate mail from some distinguished people for writing a very balanced view. And I'm also not really for it either, although there are elements of it that are probably welcome. And indeed, the Israeli opposition were calling for those elements themselves not very long ago, before Netanyahu decided to do it. And the language is so over the top. In fact, if I can just glide into another question, one of the things that's disturbed me most is not just politicians, but some very, very senior, retired, not just military figures, but intelligence figures, including former heads of the Israeli intelligence service, the external intelligence service, the Mossad, have used some extreme language about the current government, about policies, and it's, in my mind, not only inaccurate, but very disturbing, because in my mind, and I'm sure you've dealt with many figures in the worlds of intelligence and met them, not just obviously American ones, but in the Arab world, in Israel, in Europe, and so on. In general, I think they should stick to intelligence matters. They shouldn't pontificate politically. And I think in Israel's case in particular, even though Israel's stronger than it was a few years ago, it's still an embattled country surrounded by enemies. And one of the key elements of Israeli deterrence is the effectiveness or perceived effectiveness of its intelligence agencies. And if the heads of the Mossad say things that are rather extreme or stupid, some of them have said, in public, I think it waters down the mystique, the deterrence capability, the perception of that agencies. I don't know whether you share those views.
I do. There hasn't been, prior to very recently, much of this in Israel, in Europe, in the US, but it's happened recently. In Israel, it's happened within the last couple of weeks. And I think it's damaging to the country and to the Mossad. We've had it here, you know, under Trump, there was this famous letter by a whole bunch of retired CIA officials that really was a political intervention, and that seen from today does look very partisan and frankly quite embarrassing. So, you know, look, these are all democracies, and we're not talking about legislating silence on their part, but I do think we should try to return to this political and moral standard that when you've served your time, you keep quiet and you don't try to use your reputation from those days in the intelligence community to intervene in domestic politics. It's wrong. And they should say that to their friends over coffee or cocktails, but they should not use it to intervene in public debates.
I mean, there are a number of former Mossad heads who've now written books, who give TV interviews left, right, and center, all over the place. I'm thinking in particular of one of the more recent heads of the Mossad, who started saying Israel's about to become an apartheid state. Whatever one thinks, just strictly in law, that is inaccurate. He doesn't understand, never mind the fact it's wrong, he doesn't understand what apartheid is. And indeed, I know Black South African friends, just like people who lived under communism or fascism or Nazism, it's an insult to them. Apartheid was a very particular kind of political system. And I'm not suggesting Israel shouldn't be criticized for some elements of its domestic and foreign policy or policy towards the Palestinians, but inaccurate comparisons are unhelpful. And coming from a former head of the Mossad, it's a dream for Israel's opponents or for the Iranian regime or Hamas or something. They will quote him till kingdom come now.
I think that's right. And to me, this is one of the reasons that people should be so careful about terminology. These words will be used as weapons, as cudgels, by people who are truly Israel's enemies, the Iranians being a very good example. People should be much more careful in the rhetoric that they employ. And it's quite disturbing that, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. You lift up the cover and what do you see there in the Mossad is people whose political judgments are much more flawed than one would like to believe.
Yes. Some other intelligence figure from Israel said to me a few days ago, he said, Tom, just because they're in intelligence doesn't mean they're that intelligent. By meaning they may be very good at, I don't know, acquiring documents from Iran or doing various acts to try and slow down its nuclear program, but it doesn't mean they necessarily have a strategic overview. One funny little story, Shabbatai Shavit, a former head of the Mossad who died last week, and by the way, it's been reported that the cause is unknown, making speculation. In fact, we do know the cause now. He was 84, he was on hot vacation in Italy. He climbed up and down Mount Etna. Instead of taking the cable car, he said he wanted to climb. It was extremely hot. 2 months ago, he had some heart problems. He died of natural causes. I just want to make that clear for press misspeculation. Anyway, when he became head of the Mossad, Yitzhak Shamir appointed him. He then said something at the ceremony appointed to him, and Shamir said, "My God, Shavit speaks." In other words, he'd been so quiet and discreet, he never opened his mouth in public ever. So those were the old days.
We had the only analogy I would draw is Bill Casey, Reagan CIA chief, who mumbled so much, so famously that one hardly ever could understand what he was saying.
Yeah. Anyway, let's just move on to another policy issue, which is China. We know that recently China has been much more involved in the Middle East. There's been a kind of Iranian-Saudi rapprochement that took place in Beijing. The Chinese are not only getting closer to the Saudis, they're trying to get close to the Iranians. China already has close relations with North Korea, with Russia. It has its fingerprints all over Africa, investments where it gives port access. Maybe they're trying to get port access in the Iranian Gulf, the Persian Gulf area. How do you see China's interference with the Middle East? What should America do about it? And let me just add something else in to make it a more complicated question. It seems like the Biden administration has distanced himself somewhat from the Netanyahu government in Israel, as well as in the past from the Saudi administration. In other words, what should America be doing right now? It's not only Russia involved in the Middle East, it's also China.
Well, at one level, the Chinese involvement is predictable. The Middle East is the source of most of their oil. So it's not surprising that they should be concerned to guarantee the supply of that oil. But it has marked a very big change in their relations with Iran. If you go back to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Russia, China, the US, and Europe were fairly well agreed on Iran policy. That is, they could not have a nuclear weapon, and they could not be permitted to enrich uranium. If you look at the Security Council votes, the US, France, the UK, Russia, and China voted together That began to change, probably with the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2015. But today, if I said to you, well, surely the Russians and the Chinese don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, it's not so clear, not at all. And we now have certainly a military relationship between Iran and Russia. I think as part of the Chinese desire to guarantee their oil supply and their desire to be a larger force in world politics, we can predict that they're going to increase their presence in the Middle East. They now have a military base for the first time in Djibouti. Their presence is, I think, going to grow. The danger in the short run, I think, is on the Iranian nuclear question, where they're, like the Russians, they seem to be now protecting Iran, certainly in the IAEA deliberations about Iran. They're really protecting Iran rather than protesting Iranian refusals to cooperate with the IAEA. And there are many examples of that right now. The United States, if it wants to, and it's unclear whether the Biden administration does, if the United States wanted to get a condemnation of Iran for refusing to cooperate with the IAEA, they would be against it. And that is a big change over the last probably decade. What should US policy be? I think what US policy today is a push for calm. Particularly, it seems, in the 14 months until the next presidential election. You see this in the payments to Iran, $6 billion for hostages, $3 billion more, that was South Korea, $3 billion more from Iraq. I don't think that $9 billion is really for the American hostages as much as it is simply saying cool things, slow down on the nuclear front.
It's like a mafia payment. It's like the Iranian regime resembles a big
protection racket.
It's a protection racket, yes. And of course, even though the Iranians claim they will use them for non-military purposes, even if that's the case, it will free up 9 billion elsewhere to use for military and terroristic activities.
We have done this before. We know that when the Obama administration began to allow them to have more money, it didn't pay for school children's lunches. There was an increase in the amounts going to Hezbollah and others, and under sanctions, those amounts decreased. If you look at the Iranian economy in the last 2.5 years, when Trump left office, they were down to about $4 billion in usable, reachable reserves, which was about the level of, Somalia. And now it's way up. Now the amounts of oil that they are selling to China increase and increase in every 6-month period, so that the Iranian economy is actually in much better shape than it was 2.5 years ago. I would like to see much more energetic enforcement of the US sanctions on Iran, so that that economic recovery would not take place. And I would like to see an end to this, this protection racket.
Right. May I just ask you vis-a-vis Iran, just to remind people, you were the US Special Representative for Iran in 2020,
right.
Yeah. So you one of the most senior American officials dealing with Iran in the last 3 or 4 years. As far as I can possibly tell, and I wish this wasn't the case, vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, obviously one wants Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, but I'm not an optimist about getting rid of Putin, because I don't see a strong enough pro-democracy movement within Russia, or at least one that's powerful enough to necessarily replace Putin with something better than Putin. But with Iran, we see from all these demonstrations, women over removing the hijab, and we know for a long time, Iran, if there ever was a counter-revolution there, the people, many of them overnight would become close allies of America, Israel, the West in general. And the Persian people are, they're sick of fundamentalist Islam, and they'd like to be more Western. And have I got that right? In other words, it's such
without commenting on Russia.
Yeah.
I think you're quite right on Iran. The United States has been popular in Iran really for decades. And the regime, we see this time after time. They crush an uprising by the people of Iran, and then a few years later it comes back. It's an extremely unpopular regime that's managed really to kill Shia Islam in Iran. People report constantly about how empty the mosques are, about things like the difficulty that young imams have in getting married because no one wants to marry them. So I think every indication we have suggests that Iran is a country that could maintain a democratic government if they ever, for example, allowed a referendum that said, do you want an Islamic republic or do you want a democratic, if you will, Western-style government? We know who would win that referendum.
I mean, do you think the rest of the world, America and indeed others, are doing enough to encourage, or help in whatever way possible human rights? I mean, in a way, we missed the big opportunity in 2009 under Obama, where there was such huge protests from all kinds of cross sections of society, but also in the last year or so with all the protests by women removing their headscarves and so on. Do you think, just in general, obviously not in detail, the world's even paying attention or cares enough to do something?
We're not doing nothing. We're not doing zero, but I think we could be doing more. And if you think about things like broadcasting to Iran or making sure that there is internet access in Iran, it seems to me clear that we in the West could be doing a good deal more to help the people of Iran. And we could also be providing more political and moral support. There's always this view that, well, we shouldn't do that because we'll taint the protests. Well, that is not the view of Iranians.
Well, to be fair, because I've been interviewed myself on Radio Farda, which is it means tomorrow in Persian, and it's funded by the US. It has millions and millions of viewers and listeners. Also, there's a private station out of London. Just on Instagram, they have about 12 million Farsi language followers, using VPNs and so on. I don't think people often realize, certainly not on the left in the West, just what a craving there is among the Iranian population to be more pro-Western. But Elliott, I tell you what, we've almost out of time, so I want to wrap it up with, I'll put this out there. If, and it's a big if, Trump comes back, in spite of all his shortcomings, do you think specifically with the Middle East policy in Iran, one hopes it will be a better policy, let's say, in a second term? I think his first term was good compared to Obama before him and Biden since, but a second term Trump, who knows? He's a fickle character, let's say.
I think that's right. One can hope that he would return to the policies he had, which was a policy of great pressure on Iran. And I do not take the view that that policy failed. It was only in place really for the latter 2 years of his term. And we don't know whether it would have succeeded in forcing the Iranians to change their conduct. Would he? That depends partly on the people who would be surrounding him.
Will good people go to serve under him? I mean, he's burned a lot of bridges. I mean, in the first term of office, he did get in foreign policy team, including yourself, of course, but also in economic team, he attracted some quite good people, and that's why some of his policies were pretty successful.
This is a great worry of mine, that there are too many bridges burned and that a lot of qualified Republicans would refuse to serve, or having opposed him would be disqualified by Trump himself. So I worry a lot about the foreign policy of a Trump second term.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but it's been great speaking to you, fascinating, and see you soon. We've met a few times over the many years in Israel, in Washington, in London, so hope to see you again soon, Elliott.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.